What is going on, everyone? Welcome to Darren Paints Minis. My name is Darren, and today we're going to paint some old and weathered cloth on these Ossiarch Bonereaper models from Age of Sigmar. So my army scheme starts with a brown primer and a Zenithal with a couple light bone colors. This exact scheme isn't necessary for this tutorial, but I would recommend using a Zenithal as I'm going to use contrast paints for the initial base coat, and the Zenithal is going to give us some depth right off the bat. If you're not sure what a Zenithal is, check out my previous video on painting skin tones. I talk about it in detail in that video. I'm base coating the cloth with Plague Green Xpress color from Vallejo. I'm trying to get an even layer all over the cloth, but honestly, I'm not really worried about any pooling or coffee staining at this point. We're going to do enough additional work on top of it that any issues we have with the original base coat are just going to get blended in. When the base coat's done and dry, we can start on the weathered texture. Color-wise, I'm starting with an opaque paint that's a little bit brighter than our base tone. In this case, I'm using Pastel Green by Vallejo Model Color, and I'm going to be using a bit of sponge to apply it. I like the sponge because it gives a nice irregular pattern. And just like dry brushing, you want to remove excess paint from the sponge and make sure it's not completely overloaded. You can test it on your hand or a piece of the base or anything like that, and then dab off a little bit excess on a paper towel. We're then going to go around the model, focusing on the edges, folds, and raised areas of the cloth. These models in particular have a lot of holes and rips built into their cloth, so I'm spending some time around those areas as well. For the underside of the cloaks or any hard to reach places, I do what I can with the sponge, but then I go back with an older brush to do some patchy, scratchy highlights. I'm not going to worry too much about these spots as nobody's ever going to see them, and honestly, one round of highlighting is enough for these spots. Next, I'm going to make a roughly 50-50 mix of my original pastel green and bright ivory from Pro Acryl. The bright ivory is going to lighten up the green, and I'm going to reapply this in select areas. Again, trying not to completely obliterate our previous work, but focusing on those edges and high spots around the model. For one final round of sponge highlighting, I'm going to use pure bright ivory. This can be a pretty drastic jump, but don't worry, we're going to knock that back in a minute. This step should be done super sparingly, again focusing on the edges and any tears or rips in the cloth. As I said, be sparing with this bright ivory. Go light around the model for one pass and then take a look, and if there's some areas that you think could benefit from a little bit extra highlighting, you can go back and add some more. To bring all the highlights together, I'm going to apply a glaze of 4 parts medium to 1 part Plague Green, my original base coat. If you've gone a bit too heavy with the highlights, you can add multiple coats of this, but make sure that the previous layer is dry first. For mine, I only did 1 layer of this glaze and was happy with the result. now we're going to use a brown oil wash to grime things up. I've blocked in the rest of my base coats and done some highlighting on the other parts of the model because for my scheme I want to wash the entire model at once with this oil wash. You can certainly use an acrylic wash here like Agrax Earthshade, but I would suggest thinning it down with water pretty heavily, probably like 50-50 or even a little bit more. You're going to also have to be careful that you don't overload any areas and get any pooling because you don't have the ability to go back and clean things up like you do with an oil wash or with an enamel wash. One thing to note as well is that all these washes and contrast paints can sometimes be a little bit all over the place in terms of what kind of finish they're giving. And you can have glossy and matte in a mix, and it's not very nice. So to help sell the look, you may want to consider going back and using a matte varnish over the cloth when you're finished painting it. As part of my army scheme, I do an all-over matte varnish of Army Painter matte varnish as the last step before I finish up the bases. After the oil wash is dried, I've gone back in and removed a little bit from the high points and edges using a makeup sponge with a tiny bit of mineral spirits on it. This isn't super necessary, but I really like the sponging effect we got here with the highlights and wanted those to be a little bit more pronounced. And with this cleanup done, the cloth is pretty much finished. You can go back in with your original highlight colors and do a few scratchy, spotty highlights if you feel like the wash and the glazing have dulled things down a bit too much for your liking, but it's not necessary at all. I was happy with the result here, so I'm going to leave the cloaks here and finish up the rest of the models. And here's the final result. I think the old weathered cloth has come out really well and fits with the rest of the scheme. One additional thing I did do here was apply a little bit of pigment powder that I used on the base onto the lower part of the cloth. These cloaks would be touching the ground a fair bit, and this helps tie them into the environment a little bit more. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if you have any questions, by all means, pop them down in the comments below. Take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.